All right, so how about this question that
Yeah.
really gets you thinking? How does a single cell, like just one
Right.
seemingly simple embryo,
Yeah.
turn into an organism?
Yeah.
All the intricate parts, the organization. I mean, it's like the ultimate emergence story.
It really is.
And today, we're diving into the field that's tackling this head-on, developmental biology.
It's a good one.
It is a good one.
It's a really, really fascinating area.
I mean, people have been asking about this forever.
Oh, yeah, millennia.
Right.
Yeah, it's one of those big questions.
Like since the dawn of inquiry itself.
Totally.
So we're not alone in being curious.
And you, our listeners, sent in some amazing material.
Yes.
Which is really the key for us to kind of unlock this whole thing.
Yeah.
We've got this awesome entry on developmental biology from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Perfect.
So we're going to be looking at this through a philosopher's lens today to see what we can uncover.
Yeah. What are we looking to do today with this?
So our mission is to really explore those core concepts of developmental biology,
Okay.
but from a philosophical standpoint.
Okay.
What are the debates going on?
Yeah.
How do developmental biologists generate knowledge? Which is really interesting because they don't seem to have this grand unifying theory of development, which you might expect in other fields.
Yeah, you think they would. Right.
You would.
At least at first glance.
Yeah, and so we want to unpack that a bit.
Okay.
See how that works.
Yeah, and like we said, this isn't some brand new fascination.
Oh, no, no, no.
Right.
It goes way back.
Way back.
Yeah, like Aristotle.
Right. Aristotle's already thinking about this.
In The Generation of Animals.
Right.
He was looking at hierarchical structures.
Yeah.
How they come to be.
Yeah.
You know, flesh and then the organs that are made of the flesh.
Right. How do you get flesh out of just cells?
Right. Exactly. And then that question of inheritance. How do offspring actually get the traits from their parents?
Yeah.
This has been puzzling people for a long time.
And then if you fast forward to the early modern era, you have this huge debate between two camps.
Okay.
Epigenesis and preformationism.
Right. It's epigenesis.
This is the idea that complexity just arises gradually from simpler components.
Right. It's kind of built up.
Yeah, it's a building up process.
Interactions.
Right.
Yeah.
And preformationism, on the other hand.
Yeah, this is basically saying that a miniature version of the organism is already there.
Okay.
And it just unfolds.
So it's already pre-built.
Yeah, it's preformed.
Just tiny.
Yeah, like a little tiny human.
And then it gets bigger.
Exactly.
Wow.
So it's not really generation. It's more like just growth. Unfolding.
Interesting.
And Leibniz even had this idea that what looks like generation is really just development or augmentation. Kind of like a seed growing into a tree.
Right.
It was always there.
Right.
The
complexity was always there.
Just hidden. Okay.
Not visible yet.
So that's a really interesting way to frame the whole thing.
It is. And the philosophical sort of crux of this is that the thing that needs explaining changes.
Okay.
So with epigenesis, you really have to explain how those interactions actually generate new complexity.
Yeah.
Right?
And is there some inherent directionality there?
Right. Is it just random or is there something pushing it along?
Right.
Whereas with preformation, the focus is really on the mechanism of growth.
Okay.
But then you run into this problem of infinite regress.
Okay.
If the adult is performed, well, what about the preformed being inside that one?
Right.
And the one inside that one, and so on and so on.
It's like Russian nesting dolls of preformed beings.
Right. Well.
So it's a classic example of how different assumptions really lead to totally different research programs and philosophical questions about the nature of form and matter.
Okay, so where do we go from there?
Well, then things get even more interesting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the vitalism debate.
Oh, yeah. This is a big one.
This is a big one.
Right.
Yeah. Figures like Roux and Driesch really clashed over this idea of cell fate.
Okay, so what is cell fate?
Are cells already pre-programmed from the get-go?
Okay.
Or do they have a range of possibilities depending on how they interact with each other?
So, like, they could become anything.
Potentially, yeah. Or are they kind of locked in?
From day one.
From day one.
And this seems like a purely biological question.
It does on the surface, but there are huge philosophical implications.
Okay, what kind?
Well, particularly around this idea of reductionism.
Okay.
Can we really understand living things by breaking them down into their non-living parts?
Like, can we understand a cell by understanding the molecules?
Exactly. So Driesch, for example,
okay,
he actually argued for this non-material force.
Okay.
He called it entelechy.
Okay.
And he said this was guiding development.
Okay, this is separate from the material.
Yeah, it's this other thing that you can't quite measure.
Okay.
Or put your finger on.
So not scientifically fruitful then?
Not really.
Yeah.
But it does raise some really interesting questions.
Okay.
About the limits of mechanistic explanations in biology.
Okay.
And this potential for emergent properties in complex systems.
So that's like the whole is more
exactly
than the sum of its parts kind of thing.
Right. And then as we move into the 20th century,
okay,
embryology kind of goes through this big transformation.
Okay.
Becomes developmental biology.
Okay.
And a big part of that is the rise of molecular biology.
So is this the point where genes...
Yeah. Genes enter the picture. Big time.
They become like the stars of the show.
In a way, they become the prime suspects for how development happens.
Okay.
How this orchestration all comes together.
And of course, philosophers of biology.
Right. They perk up.
They get interested.
Oh, yeah. Very interested.
This is right up their alley.
Exactly. They start looking at the connections between development and evolution.
Okay.
The implications of this gene-centric view for reductionism in biology.
Okay.
Ethical questions about stem cell research.
Right. All kinds of new things.
Yeah. It really opens up a whole new area.
But the thing is, like, this Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out that philosophers have been interested in ontogeny.
Right.
The process of individual development for ages.
It's not a new thing.
No.
Right? Like Nagel, for example.
Okay.
He did a lot of work on hierarchical organization in living systems.
Okay, so what are we really looking at here when we talk about developmental biology?
Okay, so at its heart...
It's about the changes in an organism's structure over time.
So we're talking about morphology.
Morphology.
And anatomy, exactly.
So how those things change.
Yeah, how you go from a single cell to all these different parts arranged in a specific way. Yeah. And it's mainly about how the arrangement, the number, and the types of these parts all come together, how they're organized.
So the focus here is really on the physical architecture.
The structure.
Even though, obviously, the function is important.
Of course function is important, but that kind of comes later.
Okay.
First, you have to build the thing.
Okay.
And then you can see how it works.
Okay, so walk us through then, what is the sequence of events?
All right, so it's not like you have this blob of clay that instantly turns into a sculpture.
Right, it's a process.
It's a process, yeah.
What's the process?
There's a pretty conserved series of events that happens in most organisms. So it starts with fertilization.
Of course, that makes sense.
Sperm and egg get together.
Right.
And then you get cleavage.
Okay, what is that?
This is where the cell divides rapidly.
Okay.
But it doesn't actually grow that much.
So you get more cells.
More cells.
But they're the same size.
Yeah, they get smaller, actually.
Oh, okay.
So you end up with this ball of cells called a blastula.
Blastula.
Yeah, it's a great name. And then we get to gastrulation.
Okay, what is gastrulation?
This is a big one.
Okay.
This is where things really start to get organized.
Okay.
You get the 3 primary germ layers.
Okay, what are those?
So you've got the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm.
Okay, and those are going to become different parts of the body.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you also get the primitive gut forming.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is really early on.
Very early, yeah.
Okay.
And then after that, we've got organogenesis.
Organogenesis.
Yeah, this is where those germ layers actually start to make the different tissues and organs, like the heart, the lungs, all that good stuff.
So this is where things really...
Yeah, this is where it gets really complex.
For it to take shape.
Exactly. And then in some animals, like us vertebrates, you also have neurulation, the formation of the neural tube.
The neural tube.
Which will eventually become the brain and spinal cord.
Okay, so super important.
Extremely important. And then later on, you can have things like metamorphosis, like with caterpillars turning into butterflies, and even regeneration.
Oh, wow. Like when a starfish loses a limb?
Yeah, they can grow a whole new one.
That's amazing.
It is pretty incredible.
So we've got this highly orchestrated cellular ballet happening.
That's a great way to put it.
But what are the actual processes that are driving this?
Several key things are going on.
Okay.
So first, you have differentiation.
Differentiation.
Yeah. This is where cells that start out similar decide what they're going to be.
Okay.
They adopt specific identities.
Okay.
And this is important.
Yeah.
They also take on different shapes.
Oh, okay. So it's not just what they do.
No, it's how they look, too.
Okay.
Because their shape is tied to their function.
That makes sense.
And then we have pattern formation.
Okay, what is that?
This is all about setting up the spatial organization.
So like a blueprint?
Kind of, yeah. It's like establishing the axes.
Like the head and the tail?
Exactly.
The front and the back?
And the top and the bottom.
Yeah, all those directions.
Okay.
So the embryo knows where everything goes.
That makes sense.
Then we have morphogenesis.
Morphogenesis.
This is where the actual shaping happens.
Okay.
This is where those cells start moving around, changing their shape, rearranging themselves to form different tissues.
So this is like the actual construction.
Yeah, it's the building phase.
Okay.
Cells migrate.
Yeah.
They come together in layers.
They interact to create all these new forms.
It's incredible.
It is.
And then finally, you've got growth.
Growth, right? We can't forget about that.
No.
This is just the increase in size.
Uh-huh.
But it's also allometry.
Allometry.
Yeah, this is the differential growth of different parts of the body.
So like a baby's head.
Exactly. A baby's head is huge.
Proportionally.
Yeah, compared to its body.
Compared to an adult.
Right.
Okay.
So those proportions change as you grow.
That's fascinating.
It is, and it's all controlled by these processes.
So can we see this in action?
Yeah, sure.
Is there like a specific example where we can see these processes?
Let's take the development of the heart.
Oh, cardiogenesis.
Epigenesis.
Okay.
Think about it.
Yeah.
It's a complex organ.
It is.
Multiple chambers.
Yeah.
Very specific architecture.
Inside and out.
Inside and out,
Yeah.
And it's positioned asymmetrically in the chest cavity.
Yeah, it's not in the middle.
Not in the middle, no.
Why is that?
Well, that's one of the questions developmental biologists try to answer.
Okay, so what are some of the other questions?
Well, how do certain cells know to become heart muscle cells?
Right.
And then how do they get to the right place? How do they aggregate, differentiate? How does that simple tube of cells transform into those atria and ventricles?
Wow.
How does the heart grow in proportion to the rest of the body?
That's a lot of questions.
It is, but it all boils down to differentiation.
Yeah.
Pattern formation.
Morphogenesis.
Morphogenesis.
Growth, all working together.
Wow. Okay, so developmental biologists, they're trying to figure out the how behind this whole construction project.
Exactly. It's a biological construction project.
And our source material talks about developmental mechanisms.
Yes.
So what exactly is a mechanism?
Okay, so broadly speaking, a developmental mechanism is a process that happens during ontogeny.
Yeah.
Okay, during development.
During development, yeah.
Okay.
To bring about a specific outcome, philosophers of science have been looking at this idea of mechanisms a lot lately.
Okay.
And a common way to think about it is that there are 4 key parts.
Okay.
So what's the mechanism for, what's its function?
What does it do?
Yeah, what are its parts?
The constituents.
The constituents, yeah.
Okay.
How are those parts organized, and how do they interact?
Okay.
And then where and when does it all happen?
The context.
The spatiotemporal context, yeah.
So in developmental biology, we often break these mechanisms down into 2 types.
Right.
Molecular genetic and cellular physical.
Exactly.
So let's get specific. Can you give us an example of each?
All right. So for a molecular genetic mechanism, let's look at how segments form in fruit flies.
Drosophila.
Drosophila.
Okay.
Yeah. So this involves what's called the segment polarity network.
Okay.
It's a pretty complex interaction between genes like engrailed,
a hedgehog,
and wingless.
Okay.
So engrailed expression helps define the back edge of each segment.
The posterior boundary.
The posterior boundary, exactly.
Okay.
And it also makes the hedgehog signaling protein.
Okay.
And hedgehog then tells nearby cells to make wingless.
Okay, another signaling protein.
Another signaling protein, yeah.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really cool.
Okay.
Wingless then signals back
Wow.
to keep both engrailed and hedgehog going.
So it's a link.
It's a feedback loop.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like a thermostat.
Okay.
You know, controlling the temperature. But instead of heat, it's controlling the boundaries between segments.
That is so cool.
It's a really elegant system.
So genes and proteins are the constituents.
Yeah.
The feedback loop is the organization.
Right.
It happens in the Drosophila embryo at a specific time. And it's responsible for defining segment boundaries. Wow, it's like a little self-regulating system.
It is.
On a molecular level.
It's pretty amazing.
So what about a cellular physical mechanism?
Okay, so let's look at branching morphogenesis.
Branching morphogenesis.
Yeah.
This is how things like lungs and blood vessels get their branching patterns.
Okay.
So this often happens by folding or invaginating epithelial tissues.
Okay, so those are sheets of cells.
Yeah, sheets of tightly connected cells.
Okay.
But here's the thing.
Yep.
This folding can happen in different ways.
Okay.
It could be driven by cells at one end, changing shape and constricting.
Okay.
It could be due to different growth rates.
Okay.
Between layers of tissue causing buckling.
Oh, wow.
Or even external forces.
Like pushing on the tissue?
Exactly.
Wow.
And what's cool is that the same outcome,
yeah,
a branched structure, can happen through different mechanisms.
So different paths to the same result.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So again, we have our constituents, cells and tissues. We have our operations.
Constriction growth.
Yeah, mechanical forces organized in a specific place and time in the embryo. And it all results in branching structures.
Okay, so we have these two distinct flavors of mechanisms.
Right.
Molecular, genetic, and cellular, physical.
Yeah.
What kind of questions does this raise?
Well, a big one is how these two types of mechanisms actually interact during development.
Right.
How do the genetic signals trigger the physical forces and the cell behaviors?
Yeah.
And then how do those physical cues influence gene expression?
So it's like a two-way street.
Exactly. It's a constant back and forth.
Okay.
And another interesting difference is in their generality.
Okay.
So molecular genetic mechanisms.
Yeah.
They often rely on these highly conserved signaling pathways.
Okay.
And regulatory genes.
Right.
So they tend to be found in lots of different species.
Because of shared ancestry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But cellular physical mechanisms, they might be more common.
Okay.
Because of fundamental physical constraints.
Okay.
And organizational principles.
So it's not necessarily because they're related.
Not directly, no. It's more about the laws of physics.
Right.
And how things can be arranged in space.
Okay, and this difference in generality has sparked a lot of debate about explanation in developmental biology.
How do we explain things if the mechanisms are so different?
Okay, and that brings us to a key question. Is there an actual theory of development?
Right, because in philosophy of science, we tend to associate mature fields with having some overarching theory.
Yeah, like a framework.
Yeah, like a framework.
That ties everything together.
Exactly.
But when you look at developmental biology, you don't really find that.
Not really.
Right.
There's no single theory of development.
Right.
In the same way that you have the theory of natural selection in evolutionary biology.
Right.
Textbooks in developmental biology.
Yeah.
They tend to focus on different approaches.
Okay.
Like developmental genetics.
Okay.
Cell biology.
Right.
Experimental embryology. Or they catalog all the molecular players.
Okay.
And signaling pathways.
Right.
But there's no one big theory
that ties it all together.
Not that we can see, at least.
And that's kind of strange.
It is a bit.
From a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, it makes you wonder.
What's going on here?
Exactly.
So how do we interpret this lack of a unifying theory?
Well, our source material outlines 3 possibilities.
Okay.
One is that maybe there is a unifying framework.
Okay.
But it's just not explicitly labeled as a theory.
Okay.
Maybe it could be reconstructed from all those molecular models and principles.
Right.
Another possibility is that developmental biology is still too young.
Oh, okay.
It hasn't reached that level of maturity.
Like it hasn't grown up yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
And the third possibility is that there really isn't a unifying theory.
Right.
And we should take that seriously.
Okay.
What does that tell us about the field?
And it seems like the encyclopedia leans towards that third option.
It does.
Saying that developmental biology doesn't need a grand theory.
Right. It's successful without one.
Okay.
It's doing just fine. So the argument is that we already understand a lot about these fundamental developmental processes and mechanisms.
Yeah.
And this idea that a mature science has to have a theory, which is often seen as this system of laws that's being challenged here.
Okay.
And the encyclopedia also pushes back against this idea that there are hidden theoretical structures guiding research in developmental biology.
Right.
So this concept of epistemic transparency.
Epistemic transparency.
Yeah, it's key here.
Okay, what is that?
Basically, it means that the foundations of a science should be clear and accessible.
To the scientists themselves.
Exactly. Okay. If we have to come up with all these hidden frameworks to explain their reasoning, it might mean we're misunderstanding them.
Right.
We're not really getting how they do science.
So what does provide structure then?
That's the interesting part.
Yeah.
The encyclopedia proposes that developmental biology is organized around problems.
The problems.
Yeah. those big questions related to those processes we talked about.
Differentiation, morphogenesis.
Yeah. Pattern formation.
Growth.
Yeah. It's all about how does this happen?
Right.
What are the mechanisms?
So it's problem-driven.
It's problem-driven.
Not theory-driven.
Exactly. Oh. It's theory-informed, though.
Okay.
It uses knowledge from biochemistry, molecular biology, and its own domain.
Okay.
Like those models of positional information. But those theories are used to explain things. They don't dictate the research agenda.
So it's not about proving or expanding a theory.
Not really.
It's about answering those fundamental questions.
Yeah, how does development actually happen?
And that's what gives the field coherence.
It does.
This shared focus on those questions.
Yeah, how do you go from a fertilized egg to a complex organism?
And the encyclopedia points to textbooks.
Yes.
As evidence for this.
Right. So Gilbert's book,
Developmental Biology.
Yeah. It's organized around these big questions.
Okay.
And then it looks at things like the level of abstraction.
Okay.
And the diversity of organisms, the interconnectedness of processes, temporal dynamics, spatial organization.
Okay.
And Slack's book,
Essential Developmental Biology.
Right. Takes a similar approach.
Okay.
Very process-oriented.
And the key takeaway is that there's no single unifying theory dictating these presentations. It's really interesting.
It is.
That the structure comes from the questions themselves.
The questions are driving the bus.
So how do developmental biologists go about explaining things?
So their explanations are usually causal.
Okay.
They're trying to figure out how something happens. But unlike some other areas of science where the causal relationships might be static, in development, things are constantly changing.
Right.
New causal capacities emerge as the organism develops.
Okay.
So a key concept here is difference making.